What happens when someone appears to have hanged themselves?
Sure, Maggie. So when something like this happens, obviously it's horrendous, and prison authorities will then investigate the circumstances of the suicide. They will conduct an internal investigation, and they'll also consult with local law enforcement and potentially state police, depending upon the circumstances. They'll look at how he had access to the materials that led to his suicide, and they'll also assess whether or not his mental health was in such a state that perhaps prison authorities should have known more. It's early to tell, but these are the kinds of questions that they're going to ask.
We're hearing from Hernandez's agent, or TMZ is reporting that he wants to launch an investigation. Would law enforcement aid him in that investigation if he does, in fact, go down that path?
Well, it would likely work out this way. The law enforcement would conduct an investigation on its own, and then thereafter there would be an opportunity for Hernandez's representatives to gain information. And that process would play out over a period of time, but it would be one that Hernandez's attorney and his agent, and Brian Murphy is his agent, he's also an attorney, would have access to certain materials.
What about the appeal that's happening now of the murder of Odin Lloyd? Is that going to continue even after this news?
No, it will be rendered moot because of the fact that the person who is filing the appeal is no longer alive. The appeal itself no longer has a purpose. The legal issues could be reviewed, but obviously the practical effect of it has been rendered moot by his death.
We expected that Hernandez was going to be sued in civil court by several parties. So legally, what happens now? Even though Hernandez is gone, can his estate still be sued?
Yes, his estate can still be sued, and he has been sued. And what happens is the estate takes over as the defendant. And this is something that does happen where a defendant in a civil lawsuit passes away. The estate will then replace. Now, it gets a little tricky because some of the claims can be rendered moot, but the general gist of it is that the estate will take over the lawsuit as the defendant. Whether or not there's a lot of money there to sue is a separate issue.
Yeah, but we know that Hernandez had signed a big extension before he was charged with the murder of Odin Lloyd. Michael, was there any chance that Hernandez would have been freed eventually? I mean, was there a glimmer of hope for him that he would not spend the rest of his life in jail?
There was a glimmer, and I would phrase it as a glimmer or a slight chance because it's very difficult to win an appeal. He would have to successfully appeal not only a murder conviction but 3 other convictions, and usually appeals fail. Also, the judge in the Odin Lloyd trial, in my view, a lot of her decisions favored Hernandez in terms of decisions on whether to admit evidence and things like that. However, there was a glimmer in that there's an argument that the jury might have misunderstood first-degree murder, and particularly the idea that the death of Odin Lloyd was so extreme and egregious that it warranted murder 1, first-degree murder. It's very hard to prove that, but his death, Odin Lloyd wasn't tortured. He might have died pretty close to instantly. Obviously, any death is awful, but for Hernandez to be convicted not for a premeditated murder, but instead for the circumstances of the murder, that they were so depraved, there was some ground for his lawyers to argue that the jury might have misunderstood the instructions.
Okay, so what's next, if anything? Is there another step to be taken here?
The civil aspects of it will take over at this point. There'll be an investigation into the circumstances of his suicide by law enforcement. Hernandez's representatives, Brian Murphy and others, will probably demand information. The family could file a civil lawsuit if they believe that the prison failed to satisfy constitutional obligations under the 14th Amendment, which provides due process, and the 8th Amendment, which ensures that prisoners aren't subject to cruel and unusual punishment. Again, we're talking abstractly right now because we don't know if any information will surface, but there could be a legal aftermath where his family sues, and of course the people that have already sued him. There's also the issue of life insurance, whether or not Hernandez had life insurance, whether or not the policy allows for beneficiaries to recover in the event of a suicide, and if there is such a policy, whether there's a period of time between when the policy is purchased and when a suicide occurs. They're all variables. And then there's also Hernandez's pension. He played 3 years in the NFL, so he should have a pension, and the beneficiaries of it should be his daughter, because Cheyenne Jenkins Hernandez is not, as I understand it, married to him. So it would likely be his daughter to be the beneficiary.